I think maybe I'll try that one. No. Namah Shri Yatirajaya Vivekananda Suraye Satchit Sukhaswarupaya Swami Tapaharini. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to an exciting new class on Swami Vivekananda's text Rājayoga. So we'll be starting today and going very likely very slowly, because I'll probably only be teaching this class once a month about. But slowly but surely we'll make our way through to the end. That's the hope. I encourage you to follow along as I read. So those of you watching at home and in person, you can either bring a hard copy or use a soft copy. There are many soft copies available. One that's good is the website ramakrishnavivekananda.info, I-N-F-O. And you click on volume 1 of the complete works, and then Rājayoga is in volume 1. So you can follow along. That's one thing. Secondly, this book is it's comprised of 2 parts. And the first part is Swami Vivekananda's exposition of Rājayoga, especially based on the Ashtanga Yoga, the eight-limbed yoga of Patañjali, from Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. And then part 2 is just a running translation and commentary on Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. That's the second part. So I want to cover both parts in sequence, which means we're going to focus on part 1 page by page first, and then once that's finished, we'll start on Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, and I'll retitle it as Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, the class titles, using Swami Vivekananda's translation and commentary, but also consulting traditional commentaries some of them like Vyasa, Vijnana Bhikshu, and others, and looking at modern scholars like Edwin Bryant and Gerald James Larson and others. So that'll be a kind of class within a class in a sense. It'll be completely focused on Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, but it won't be a while until we get to it because of the snail's pace at which we'll be going through part 1. Okay, so that's just a general heads up. Now, some information about the text. The original title of the book, when it was first published in 1896, is somewhat different and very long-winded, so I'm going to read it to you. It's published in the West. It's called Yoga Philosophy, then a space. Lectures delivered in New York, winter of 1895-6, by the Swami Vivekananda on Rājayoga, or Conquering the Internal Nature. That's the title we have now, just that middle part. But it continues. Also, Patanjali's Yoga Aphorisms with commentaries. That's the whole title. So, yeah, it's almost an abstract of the book. So, that's how titles were sometimes at that time period in the late 19th century, early 20th century. It was very informative, so we at least get a sense of what the book is about. Now, the next big question, the term Rājayoga is somewhat unusual. What does it mean? And this is actually a very complicated question. So complicated that scholars have written entire articles on this. One of them I'd recommend, if you're interested in going deep into the textual history of the term Rājayoga, is an article by Jason Birch, B-I-R-C-H, published in the International Journal of Hindu Studies in 2013. And the title of the article is Rājayoga, the Reincarnations of the King of All Yogas. That's the title of the article. So Raja literally means king. And so Rājayoga means the king of all yogas. And what he traces is the history of the use of the term Rājayoga, going back many, many centuries. But one thing that he finds, which is striking, is that different people mean different things by Rājayoga. In fact, the first use of the term, or one of the first, according to this scholar Jason Birch, is from a 12th century Shaiva text called Amanaska. But there, Rājayoga is not grounded in Patanjali's Ashtanga Yoga or the Yoga Sutra at all. In fact, the term Rājayoga is not usually associated with Patanjali. It's sometimes associated with the Ashtanga Yoga, the eight-limbed yoga. But the eight-limbed yoga itself is not necessarily connected with Patanjali's system. So it gets kind of complicated. But one of the reasons I mention all this is because I think Swami Vivekananda himself kind of underplays the originality of this text, but it strikes me as a highly original text. In fact, this is, I think, the very first work of Swami Vivekananda that I'd read when I was a PhD student. I read it sort of independently, not part of my studies. And I was so inspired after reading it that I ordered the whole 9 volumes, the complete works from India, and they shipped them to me, and I read the whole thing as a PhD student. So this is a very inspiring text. But I think he underplays the originality of the text. And one of the things that's highly original about the text is that it's really Swami Vivekananda who conceives Rājayoga as based on Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. It hadn't really been theorized in that way before him, in that way. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. One thing that Rājayoga itself was already a common term. Sri Ramakrishna, for instance, in the Gospel, if any of you have read the Gospel, Sri Ramakrishna often contrasts Hatha Yoga with Rājayoga. Hatha Yoga being physical postures and physical practices, and Rājayoga being the practice of concentration and meditation usually. And Sri Ramakrishna would often say Hatha Yoga is inferior to Rājayoga because it's based on bodily practices that might actually strengthen body consciousness, when the whole point of spiritual practice is to go beyond or transcend body consciousness. And it says, therefore, Rājayoga is the preferable of these two yogas. So you'll find similar kinds of statements being made in Swami Vivekananda's text, Rājayoga. And that was a pretty common motif in the preceding centuries, that Rājayoga is superior to Hatha Yoga. One example of a text that says this is Hatha Paradipika, which is about Hatha Yoga, but then it also explains how Hatha Yoga is a kind of preliminary practice which should make you fit to practice the higher practice of Rājayoga, which alone leads to the highest goal. Okay. Another thing to keep in mind is in chapter 8 of this book, of part 1 of this book, before he goes into his translation of Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, Swami Vivekananda himself, let me just read you, I'm just jumping ahead a little bit just to give you a sense of. Okay, chapter 8 is titled Rājayoga in Brief. So after explaining Rājayoga in detail, chapter by chapter, he says Rājayoga in brief. And then he says, the following is a summary of Rājayoga freely translated from the Kurma Purana. This is very interesting. So after explaining in his own words, based on his own spiritual experiences and practices, Rājayoga, he then, in chapter 8, just gives a kind of free translation of a passage from the Kurma Purana, an old medieval Puranic text, which explains Rājayoga in terms of Ashtanga Yoga. So that's clearly one of his sources for understanding Rājayoga. Kurma Purana. Okay, now, from a philosophical standpoint, though, another way that I think the way that Swami Vivekananda himself explains Rājayoga might be a little misleading is, I'm jumping ahead here. We're going to go line by line, but I'm just reading to you from the preface, which we're going to start to talk about today. He says, the subject of the present book is that form of yoga known as Rājayoga. The aphorisms of Patañjali are the highest authority on Rājayoga and form its textbook. So this sentence, that the authoritative text or scripture on which Rājayoga is based is Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, might lead us to think that he's going to give a straight, faithful exposition of Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, and that's what Rājayoga is. That would be a mistake, because he's not giving a straight explanation of Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, Patanjali's yoga philosophy. I consider this text quite an original synthesis, philosophical synthesis. It's a kind of philosophically hybrid text, combining ideas from Patanjali's Yoga Sutra with ideas from Tantra, especially what's called Kundalini Yoga. The concept of the Kundalini and the chakras, completely non-existent in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. You won't find any mentions of it in the Yoga Sutra at all. But it's something he emphasizes in part 1 of this book. That comes from Tantra. So it's a mixture of Patanjali's yoga system, yoga philosophy, some Tantra, especially Kundalini Yoga, and some Vedanta. What's the Vedantic element? Let's start. So we'll see the Vedanta right in the very beginning. Because, yeah.
So are you saying that...
You should use the mic.
So were you saying that Tantra is the only part of the, I don't know, Shastras or whatever that talks about Kundalini Yoga, or do other parts, is it only in the Tantra where they talk about Kundalini Yoga?
Tantra is the original source of Kundalini Yoga.
Really?
And then
so,
other schools.
But Tantra is relatively recent compared to the Vedas and all that, isn't it?
Tantra is quite old.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. We don't know how old, but quite old.
But they mention Kundalini Yoga in the Vedas and stuff like that? No. Puranas?
Maybe later Puranas which are influenced by Tantra, but the point is that it's really Tantric texts that first talk about Kundalini.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Let me read you the table of contents to give you a sense of the overall structure of the book. Part 1 is called Rājayoga. Author's preface, which we'll start to talk about today. Even if we don't finish it, we'll at least try to get through most of it. Then introductory, then the first steps, then prana, the psychic prana, the control of psychic prana, pratyahara and dharana, which are the 5th and 6th limbs of Ashtanga Yoga of Patañjali. Then the next chapter is dhyana and samadhi, the 7th and 8th limbs of Patanjali's Ashtanga Yoga. And then Rājayoga in brief, which is his summary of Kurma Purana. And then part 2 of the book is Patanjali, it's entitled Patanjali's Yoga Aphorisms. And he just translates it with a commentary. Okay? So, another striking thing about this text is it begins with an epigraph. What's an epigraph? A striking, eye-catching, thought-provoking quotation that goes at the beginning of a text. I like them myself. I use them in the beginning of my books. So, this book starts with an epigraph. And guess whom he's quoting? He's quoting himself. Which is funny. Okay, because he's taking this from his own commentary on 2.25 of the Yoga Sutra in his translation, which comes in the second half of the book. Okay? So let's look at it, and then we'll see why I'm calling this more Vedantic than yogic in Patanjali's sense. Each soul is potentially divine. The goal is to manifest this divinity within by controlling nature, external and internal. Do this either by work or worship or psychic control or philosophy, by one or more or all of these, and be free. This is the whole of religion. Doctrines or dogmas or rituals or books or temples or forms are but secondary details. All right. In a separate class I gave quite a few months ago, I talked about these 4 mantras in detail. I call them Swami Vivekananda's 4 mahamantras. And I think they contain in a nutshell what I would call Swami Vivekananda's philosophy of non-sectarian Vedanta. Non-sectarian because it's extremely broad, and because these core principles can actually help us to harmonize the different sectarian schools of Vedanta and even the different world religions and things like that. It's so broadly defined. That's why he says each soul is potentially divine. He's very, very deliberately vague here. He doesn't say, Aham Brahmasmi, I am that non-dual Brahman, because that would be more sectarian, that would be Shankara's school. He doesn't say I am a part and God is a whole, because that would only be Ramanuja's school. Do you see what I mean? He's being very, very vague. Well, that's my claim. Yeah, but take it, for what it's worth. So I think he's being deliberately vague in order to encompass many different conflicting philosophical schools and spiritual philosophies. The second Mahamantra is interesting. The goal is to manifest this divinity within. That's fine, and it makes sense. But then he says, by controlling nature, external and internal. What does he mean by internal nature? It should be relatively clear from the subtitle of this book, because it's Rājayoga is defined as conquering the internal nature. So what is the internal nature? Any guesses?
Mind.
Yeah, mind, exactly. Yeah, mind, very good. In general, it's just mind. External nature is a little trickier. And I think actually it's not comprehensible unless you look at his commentary on 2.25 of Yoga Sutra, where he pulls out these statements. And I'm just going to summarize. I discussed this in more detail in that class, so you can look at the class on YouTube if you're interested. But basically, the thing to keep in mind in the context of Indian philosophy is that both this physical body and the mind are both actually insentient matter. So they're both nature, equally nature. It's just that the physical body is a gross form of matter, and the mind is a subtle form of matter. So in his commentary on 2.25 of Yoga Sutra, he clarifies what he means by external nature. He means the physical body. Okay? So what does it mean to control the physical body, and how is that going to help you in spiritual practice? And now this is where it gets a little bit speculative and you have to bring in your own interpretation. My interpretation is that he's emphasizing the need for what Vedantins call Dhamma. There's Shama, and Shama is control of the mind, as a spiritual practice. Dhamma is the control of the sense organs, preventing them from going outwards, checking their outgoing tendency. So my suggestion is that when he says that the goal is to manifest this divinity within by controlling nature, external and internal, he means controlling the mind, which is internal nature, and controlling the senses primarily, which is called Dhamma in Vedanta. Okay. The third mahamantra, do this either by work or worship or psychic control or philosophy, by one or more or all of these, and be free. So I hope you can see why I'm calling this Vedanta, because this is very distinctively non-sectarian Vedanta. He's emphasizing that there are 4 royal roads, 4 yogas, leading to the same goal of manifesting our divinity. First is work, that's karma yoga. Second is worship, which is bhakti yoga. The third is psychic control, which is so this is the framework. And then the fourth is philosophy, which is jnana yoga. A couple things here. First of all, by one or more or all of these and be free. Here again, he's signaling that he's not following any of the sectarian Vedantic schools. Why? Because every sectarian school puts one yoga above all the others. Shankara's Advaita Vedanta puts Jnana Yoga above the other yogas. Bhakti schools of Vedanta put Bhakti Yoga, obviously, above the other yogas. Swamiji doesn't have a hierarchy of yogas. And he says, by one or more or all of these, you can reach the same goal. You can pursue one independently, or you can combine them. So that, again, is very distinctively non-sectarian in its orientation. And the second thing I wanted to bring your attention is this term psychic control. Because, as you noticed, that's what corresponds to Rājayoga, which is the book before us, right? So what I think he's doing in this epigraph, it's he himself who pulled out these statements from his commentary on 2.25 of Yoga Sutra and foregrounded it in this way at the very beginning of this book. But I think he's announcing at the outset that you're not going to get straight Patañjali here. You're getting, he's already putting Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, Rājayoga, within a broader non-sectarian Vedantic framework. It is one of the 4 main yogas for reaching the highest spiritual goal of manifesting our innate divinity. Okay? This is not a statement that Patanjali would have agreed with, as far as I can tell. Do you see what I mean? Patanjali doesn't talk about 4 yogas leading to the same goal. He talks about Ashtanga yoga as leading to the goal. And so on and so forth. Okay? So, and then the 4th Mahamantra, also profoundly Vedantic. This is the whole of religion. Doctrines or dogmas or rituals or books or temples or forms are but secondary details. So even books, even his own book Rājayoga, even the book Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, these are all but secondary details. And the essentials are contained in the first 3 principles, the first 3 Mahamantras. Okay? So let's keep in mind that Swami Vivekananda is first and foremost a Vedantin, but a very broad, liberal, non-sectarian Vedantin. And he is providing an interpretation of Patanjali's Yoga Sutra and Rājayoga from a Vedantic perspective. Okay? So, I suggest we dive into it now. So let's start with the preface. The preface is a couple pages, and we'll see if we can finish it, but I don't want to rush either. Okay, the preface. I'll read maybe the first 2 paragraphs, and then we'll discuss, and then we'll move forward. Since the dawn of history, various extraordinary phenomena have been recorded as happening amongst human beings. Witnesses are not wanting in modern times to attest to the fact of such events, even in societies living under the full blaze of modern science. The vast mass of such evidence is unreliable, as coming from ignorant, superstitious, or fraudulent persons. In many instances, the so-called miracles are imitations. But what do they imitate? It is not the sign of a candid and scientific mind to throw overboard anything without proper investigation. Surface scientists, unable to explain the various extraordinary mental phenomena, strive to ignore their very existence. They are therefore more culpable than those who think that their prayers are answered by a being or beings above the clouds, or than those who believe that their petitions will make such beings change the course of the universe. The latter have the excuse of ignorance, or at least of a defective system of education, which has taught them dependence upon such beings, a dependence which has become a part of their degenerate nature. The former have no such excuse. For thousands of years, such phenomena have been studied, investigated, and generalized. The whole ground of the religious faculties of man has been analyzed, and the practical result is the science of Rājayoga. Rājayoga does not, after the unpardonable manner of some modern scientists, deny the existence of facts which are difficult to explain. On the other hand, it gently, yet in no uncertain terms, tells the superstitious that miracles and answers to prayers and powers of faith, though true as facts, are not rendered comprehensible through the superstitious explanation of attributing them to the agency of a being or beings above the clouds. It declares that each man is only a conduit for the infinite ocean of knowledge and power that lies behind mankind. It teaches that desires and wants are in man, that the power of supply is also in man, and that wherever and whenever a desire, a want, a prayer has been fulfilled, it was out of this infinite magazine that the supply came, and not from any supernatural being. The idea of supernatural beings may rouse to a certain extent the power of action in man, but it also brings spiritual decay. It brings dependence. It brings fear. It brings superstition. It degenerates into a horrible belief in the natural weakness of man. There is no supernatural, says the yogi, but there are in nature gross manifestations and subtle manifestations. The subtle are the causes, the gross, the effects. The gross can be easily perceived by the senses, not so the subtle. The practice of Rājayoga will lead to the acquisition of the more subtle perceptions. So let's pause here. First of all, it's striking that he begins by mentioning modern science. I mean, this is late 19th century, and he's talking about modern science in the way that many modern scientists dismiss various kinds of yogic phenomena, what he calls extraordinary phenomena. What do you think he has in mind? Maybe certain psychic powers, because at that time, you also have to keep in mind the historical context. Throughout the world, in the West, in the US, in England, and other places where he was visiting, there was this whole new kind of spiritualist movement with all sorts of New Age, what we would now call New Age movements, spiritual movements, involving mediums, psychic mediums, Ouija boards, all sorts of stuff, faith healing, seances, magnetic healing. Also, I mean, the list goes on. It was a huge, I mean, it was a kind of a cottage industry at the time. And he was aware of all that. And he doesn't actually say that it's all bogus. He says a lot of it is bogus. So he says in this first paragraph, in many instances, the so-called miracles are imitations. But what do they imitate? So sometimes he admits that in a lot of cases, they're either frauds or they're not consciously deceiving people, but they're nonetheless, they're not real, what's happening. But he can't deny that. And I think even any objective scientist who's open-minded can't deny that in some cases, these things seem to be true. Some people do seem to be psychic and so on and so forth. Okay, and in that first paragraph, he mentions what he calls surface scientists, which I really like as a phrase, surface scientists. There's a term which is used now in philosophy of science called scientism. Does anyone know what the term scientism means? Anyone? No? Scientism. Okay. Scientism actually has different meanings. If you want like a more rigorous discussion of this, look at chapter 4 of my book on Swami Vivekananda. But I'm giving you a very brief overview here. Scientism in general, in the most popular sense, means kind of thinking that science is the be-all and end-all. because science has tremendous prestige. It has enjoyed that kind of prestige for a few hundred years now, post-Enlightenment, right? And because it's good at all sorts of things, like, that's how we got electricity in cars and planes and all sorts of things. Therefore, we should rely on science to tell us what exists and what doesn't exist. And if I can't investigate through our modern scientific methods and instruments, like microscopes and telescopes, let's say the soul or God or anything beyond the senses, then there's no reason to believe it exists. In fact, it doesn't exist. So the scientistic scientist, so the scientist who subscribes to scientism, is the person who is not content with engaging in science, practicing science as a methodology, as a tool that you use to investigate nature, but basically drawing a philosophical conclusion on the basis of science, which is nothing exists apart from what is investigatable through the natural sciences. You see. And the problem with scientism is that it's unprovable on scientific grounds. No scientist has been able to prove the truth of scientism. How can you possibly prove that the only entities that exist are those that are investigatable through the natural sciences? Go ahead and try. Nobody has succeeded, as far as I'm aware. So I think Swami Vivekananda has in mind all of this, because in his time there was a famous scientist named T.H. Huxley, Thomas Henry Huxley, who was called Darwin's bulldog, because he was a hardcore Darwinian and an agnostic. He coined the term agnosticism, by the way, T.H. Huxley, in the mid to late 1800s. And Swamiji had in mind these kinds of scientists, but Huxley will go further and say science has basically disproved the existence of God, and so on and so forth. So Swamiji, as I think, has in his crosshairs these kinds of science. He has no problem with science as long as the scientists know their place. But the moment they start making untenable, unjustified philosophical claims about what exists and what doesn't exist on the basis of science, then he says these scientists are not being scientific enough, in a sense. They're going beyond the domain of what's legitimately considered science. Okay, so I think he calls these surface scientists basically scientists who subscribe to scientism, which he thinks is an untenable doctrine. Then he says something quite interesting, and he goes on for a while about prayer, and it might initially jolt us, because he seems to be saying, superficially, people who think that when they pray to God, that their prayers are answered by a being, by some supreme being, they're foolish, they're superstitious. So we need to be very careful about what he's saying here. Okay. Yeah, exactly. I think that's an important phrase there, which helps to, above the clouds. So he says, those people who, so let me read you again the sentence here. Those who think that their prayers are answered by a being or beings above the clouds.
You're talking about the anthropomorphic Christian God, right?
Yeah, and also that's completely separate from this universe and separate from us. I think that's the really important point, okay? Or than those who believe that their petitions will make such beings change the course of the universe. Okay, and he's making fun of them for these people. But then he makes it even clearer, because he brings up the above the clouds again in the next paragraph when he says, it gently, meaning Rājayoga, yet in no uncertain terms, tells the superstitious that miracles and answers to prayers and powers of faith, though true as facts, so he's not denying that these things are efficacious, are not rendered comprehensible through the superstitious explanation of attributing them to the agency of a being or beings above the clouds. And again, you get this above the clouds, meaning this God which is transcendent, which is beyond this world and not at all within us. And he's saying, by contrast, it declares, meaning Rājayoga, declares that each man is only a conduit for the infinite ocean of knowledge and power that lies behind mankind. Okay, and then he goes on to explain that whenever a prayer is answered, we ourselves answer the prayer. But what does he mean by the we here? The we is God. So I think actually, to understand what he's saying here, I think he's presupposing Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana framework, which is that there's nothing but God, and each one of us is a manifestation of God. Let me give you some examples to corroborate my interpretation of what he's saying. I think one useful way to do that is to bring in things he says elsewhere. So, Inspired Talks, he says the following: your own will is all that answers prayer. Only it appears under the guise of different religious conceptions to each mind. We may call it Buddha, Jesus, Krishna, Jehovah, Allah, Agni, but it is only the self, the I. So here, I think, again, he has in mind, as Sri Ramakrishna used to teach, the Vijnani sees that Brahman has become the 24 cosmic principles. Brahman has actually become each jiva, each individual soul, and everything in this world. So I think if we keep in mind that, then I think we won't be so jarred by what he's saying here. Yeah. Okay. So that's prayer. And then, at the end of the second paragraph, he says, there is no supernatural, says the yogi, but there are in nature gross manifestations and subtle manifestations. The subtle are the causes, the gross the effects. The gross can be easily perceived by the senses, not so the subtle. The practice of Rājayoga will lead to the acquisition of the more subtle perceptions. What does Swami Vivekananda have in mind by subtle manifestations of nature? Gross manifestations means we know, trees and things that we can see with the senses. What does he mean by subtle manifestations of nature? I think he has in mind, this is again based on Patañjali here, but especially I give you that little overview of the table of contents, and you notice that fully three of the chapters are on what he calls prana. Chapters, I don't know what they're numbered, but 3, 4, and 5, I think. Prana, then he has a chapter called the psychic prana, and then he has the next chapter is called the control of psychic prana. Prana, which is very hard to translate, we'll talk about it when we get to the chapter, but breath is not quite right actually, it's more fundamental than breath. Breath is a gross manifestation of prana, which is a subtle form of nature. And so if we can control, and so his idea is, we'll find that he talks about this later, pranayama, control of prana. What he says is, by controlling the breath, which is the gross manifestation of prana, you can end up controlling prana itself, which is the subtle force behind the breath, controlling the breath. Or manifesting as a breath would be better. Okay? So I think he has in mind here primarily prana when he talks about subtle manifestations of nature. But I think he also has in mind things like samskaras. That's a term that's used commonly frequently in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. Samskara means latent mental impressions. Patanjali is, I think, rightly considered a kind of proto-Freud in a way, because he deeply recognized the importance and pervasiveness of the role of the unconscious in human life, and to what extent the unconscious kind of makes us do the things we do without us knowing it, and that part of being a healthy individual and psychologically and mentally is to become aware of what's happening at the unconscious level. And Patanjali is all about that. That's why samskaras are so important in his philosophy, and trying to understand what our samskaras are and how we can change them by changing our current behavior. Yeah, unconscious. So so subconscious is, from a technical standpoint, not quite the same thing as unconscious, but the unconscious would be the term, unbewusst. It depends on the psychologist. I'd have to go to Freud and see but he has a different place for it. Okay. So now, let's finish it. I think we can actually finish the preface here. So I'm gonna read up to the end of the preface, and then we'll talk. All the orthodox systems of Indian philosophy have one goal in view: the liberation of the soul through perfection. The method is by yoga. The word yoga covers an immense ground, but both the Sankhya and the Vedanta schools point to yoga in some form or other. The subject of the present book is that form of yoga known as Rājayoga. The aphorisms of Patañjali are the highest authority on Rājayoga and form its textbook. The other philosophers, though occasionally differing from Patañjali on some philosophical points, have, as a rule, acceded to his method of practice a decided consent. The first part of this book comprises several lectures to classes delivered by the present writer in New York. The second part is a rather free translation of the aphorisms, Sūtras, of Patañjali, with a running commentary. Effort has been made to avoid technicalities as far as possible, and to keep to the free and easy style of conversation. In the first part, some simple and specific directions are given for the student who wants to practice. And then he emphasizes this, he puts it in italics. But all such are especially and earnestly reminded that, with a few exceptions, yoga can only be safely learnt by direct contact with the teacher. If these conversations succeed in awakening a desire for further information on the subject, the teacher will not be wanting. Final paragraph. The system of Patañjali is based upon the system of the Sankhyas, the points of difference being very few. The two most important differences are, first, that Patañjali admits a personal God in the form of a first teacher, while the only God the Sankhyas admit is a nearly perfected being, temporarily in charge of a cycle of creation. Second, the yogis hold the mind to be equally all-pervading with the soul, or purusha, and the Sankhyas do not. So these are dense paragraphs because he has in mind a lot of different philosophical schools. And I'll just begin to kind of explain some of the things here. Starting with the first sentence, actually, all the orthodox systems of Indian philosophy have one goal in view: liberation of the soul through perfection. What does he have in mind here when he talks about the orthodox systems of Indian philosophy? Any idea? Not exactly. As far as, I mean, I can't prove that my interpretation is correct. But basically, in the history of Indian philosophy, there are what are called astika systems of Indian philosophy and nastika. Okay? And in most modern Indian languages, astika is somebody who believes in God, and a nastika is somebody who is an atheist who doesn't believe in God. That's not the sense that it's used in the context of Indian philosophy. Astika means any school of philosophy that accepts the authority of the Vedas. And Nastika is any philosophy that does not accept the authority of the Vedas. So what are the Nastika schools of Indian philosophy? Buddhism. What's the second one? Buddhism is 1, 2 is Jainism, 3?
Buddhism, Jainism, is 6?
No. Charvaka. Charvaka, which is a materialist school, kind of still is. It's really the dominant philosophy throughout the world even now. But in any case, it was a well-known philosophical school millennia ago, which teaches basically eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. And one of the Charvaka texts says that the Vedas are the ravings of lunatics. And there's no such thing as an eternal soul, and when you die, you die. I mean, there's consciousness ceases. And anyway, okay, so 3 Nastika, meaning heterodox schools of Indian philosophy, are Buddhism, Jainism, and Charvaka, materialism, the school of Charvaka materialism. Now, this is like this traditional schema I'm telling you. There are 6 Astika schools of Indian philosophy. Astika means orthodox, in the sense of accepting the authority of the Vedas. What are they? Okay, no, not those. So 2 of them are the ones that he mentions, Sankhya and Yoga. And they're paired. Why are they paired? They're actually 3 pairs comprising 6. Sankhya and Yoga. Why? Because they're kind of like brothers, or not exactly brothers. Sankhya is the older one, and Yoga is grounded in Sankhya metaphysics. Okay. Second pair, Nyaya Vaisheshika. Nyaya is, if any of you have heard of it, it's incredibly technical, hair-splitting stuff that goes into sort of logic chopping, and it's the equivalent of kind of analytic philosophy in India. Analytic philosophy is all the rage now in the West. This is like kind of an early form of analytic philosophy in India, Nyaya philosophy. And Vaisheshika is an allied system, and Nyaya builds on Vaisheshika and accepts more or less most of Vaisheshika, but goes further and pushes it in a more logical direction, developing it as a logical system. Okay, so Sankhya Yoga, 1 and 2. Nyaya Vaisheshika, 3 and 4. There are 2 left. Any guesses?
Just tell us.
Okay, well, I'm going to tell you now. There are 2 schools of Mimamsa. Purva Mimamsa and Uttara Mimamsa. Purva means like the prior, the first Mimamsa, and Uttara means the latter Mimamsa. So the former Mimamsa and the latter Mimamsa. And another word, a more common term for Uttara Mimamsa, the latter Mimamsa, is Vedanta, exactly. This is where Vedanta comes. So if I had a PowerPoint or something, it would be, first of all, the 6 Astika schools. One of the 6 is Vedanta. And then I'd have separate branches going, that Vedanta actually encompasses many different schools, sub-schools of Vedanta. There's Advaita Vedanta.
What's its brother one?
Purva Mimamsa.
And that's before it?
Yeah.
And what is that?
It's based, yeah, so that's important because I'm going to quibble with the statement of Swamiji's. He says, all the orthodox systems of Indian philosophy have one goal in view, the liberation of the soul to perfection. I don't think Purva Mimamsa has that as the goal. Mimamsa, Purva Mimamsa, is based on the Karma Kanda of the Vedas, which means the ritualistic portion of the Vedas. And Purva Mimamsa is all about follow strictly to the letter exactly what the Vedas tell you about how to perform sacrifices. And if you do, what happens? Swarga Kamo Yajeta, which is a mantra from one part of the Karma Kanda, which means by practicing these sacrifices, you can ultimately attain Swarga, heaven. You can attain happiness here and hereafter. Once you leave the body, you will dwell in a heaven. But that's not liberation. Why? Because it's not permanent. It's not eternal. You have to come back. And then what do you do when you come back? You perform sacrifices again, ritualistic sacrifices, exactly according to the Vedas, in order to maximize your happiness here. And then again, when you leave the body, you go to a temporary heaven and you go back. So there's no liberation according to Purva Mimamsa. So this is, if Swamiji were here, I would raise my hand and ask him that question. Mimamsa means literally inquiry, rational inquiry. Yeah. And so Purva Mimamsa is inquiry into basically the Karma Kanda, the ritualistic portion of the Vedas, which tells us how to do sacrifices, what are the results of sacrifice, the great things that happen if we do the sacrifices properly. That's it. But liberation, moksha, is not the ideal of Purva Mimamsa. It's the ideal of the Jnana Kanda, the knowledge portion of the Vedas, aka the Upanishads. The Upanishads. Jnana Kanda is the knowledge portion of the Vedas is the Upanishads. What do the Upanishads teach? That the goal is liberation from the cycle of rebirth. How do you attain it? Through knowledge of Brahman. So that's Vedanta. Jnana Kanda, aka Upanishads, aka Vedanta, in the original sense. Okay? That's Uttara Mimamsa, aka Uttara Mimamsa. Thank you. So there's 4 AKs here. Yeah.
What was the last one? The more recent?
Yeah, well, actually, it's not quite Uttara Mimamsa.
Taking the train of...
Sorry, no, hold on. There's one slight thing I should add. See, Uttara Mimamsa is one of the 6 schools of Indian philosophy. Okay? And so Vedanta in that sense is this school of Indian philosophy which is based on the Upanishads. It's not identical to the Upanishads because, as we know, many different Vedantins have interpreted the Upanishads in completely different ways. Right? Ramanuja's Vishtadvaita Vedanta is based on the Upanishads, so is Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, and so is Madhva's school and all these others, right? Okay. So that's why the AK is just, Jnana Kanda equals Upanishads equals, what was the third term? Vedanta. Vedanta in the original sense. Yeah. Okay? All right. Then Swamiji says, the method to reach liberation is yoga. And here, again, so this is very clearly Vedantic, but in this non-sectarian Vedantic way. What are the 4 yogas? The ones he mentions in the epigraph. Karma Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, Jnana Yoga, Raja Yoga. And then he says, so this is how he's placing Raja Yoga and Patanjali's Yoga Sutra within the broader framework of his non-sectarian Vedanta. He says, the subject of the present book is that form of yoga known as Raja Yoga. You see, psychic control, referred to in the epigraph as psychic control. And then the aphorisms of Patanjali are the highest authority on Raja Yoga and form its textbook. Here, as I said, I think the sentence could be misleading because it might make us think that he is giving us a straight exposition of Patanjali, being strictly faithful to Patanjali's system of philosophy, but I don't think he is. And I don't see that as a problem. I see that as one of the most original aspects of his project, of what he's doing. It's a very original philosophical and spiritual synthesis, combining Patanjali with Kundalini Yoga, with aspects of Vedanta. Okay? Okay. And finally, this last paragraph, it's the most technical paragraph in a way. I'll read it one more time. The system of Patanjali is based upon the system of the Sankhyas. Remember the three pairings within the Orthodox schools, Astika schools? Sankhya, Yoga. Patanjali's yoga system is based on Sankhya philosophy. The points of difference between Sankhya and Yoga being very few, according to Swamiji. The two most important differences are first, that Patanjali admits a personal God in the form of a first teacher, while the only God the Sankhyas admit is a nearly perfected being, temporarily in charge of a cycle of creation. Second, the yogis hold the mind to be equally all-pervading with the soul, or Purusha, and the Sankhyas do not. Okay, there's a lot here. We're not going to go into too much detail here because it's not that important, but I think we need a basic understanding of Sankhya philosophy. Yeah.
So when he says...
Mike, please.
So when he says that Patanjali admits a personal God in the form of a first teacher, is that a guru? Is that what he means?
In a sense, but it's complicated. I mean, I'll get to that in a second.
Okay.
So, okay, Sankhya is basically a school of metaphysical dualism because it posits two fundamental entities, Purusha and Prakriti. Prakriti is defined as nature with the capital N, and from nature with the capital N, you get everything that you see here, everything made of the five elements, okay? And then on the other side is what Sankhya calls Purusha, which can be translated in different ways, soul or consciousness, okay? Let's take soul, even though it may not be an ideal translation, but let's take soul. It's eternal, and it's immaterial, and it's conscious. And so there's this very strict bifurcation between the domain of nature with the capital N, which is strictly insentient, jada, and on the other side we have Purusha, which is consciousness. But another important thing to keep in mind with respect to both Sankhya and Yoga is that there are multiple Purushas. This is not Vedanta, like non-dual Vedanta. You have a distinct Purusha, you have a different Purusha, you have a different Purusha, okay? And according to Sankhya, we suffer because we mistakenly identify with the psychophysical complex, with the body-mind complex. But where does the body fall on the Purusha Prakriti within that schema? The Prakriti side, the body is a gross form of matter. Where does the mind fall?
Same.
Also on the nature side. And so through spiritual practice, especially according to Sankhya, Viveka, discrimination, between what? Between Purusha and Prakriti. I'm not the body, I'm not the mind, I am the eternal witness, the Purusha, the eternal soul separate from the body-mind complex. By practicing this constantly and doing other things, what happens? I attain what's called Kaivalya, which literally means isolation or separation or aloneness also. But it's very literally, it means aloneness. It means you realize your true nature as a Purusha, as an eternal soul, an eternal conscious soul separate from the body-mind complex. And there's no possibility of suffering because the Purusha is completely free from suffering. So that's the basic Sankhya philosophy. Patanjali's yoga philosophy just inherits that system, accepts it fully, except, as Swamiji points out, for some minor differences. The first one is not really minor, it's a fairly significant one. Sankhya does not emphasize God much, although it's complicated. I mean, modern scholarship on Sankhya actually shows that there are multiple schools of Sankhya, and some of them are Seshvara, others are Nirishvara. Seshvara means some have a god of some sort, a personal god, and others don't. But during Swamiji's time, the assumption was that Sankhya was basically an atheistic philosophy. So that's the first difference. Whereas Patanjali, interestingly, we'll find this, 1.23 of the Yoga Sutra, Patanjali is talking about different ways of attaining kaivalya, realization of yourself as Purusha. And he has this wonderful sutra, 1.23, Ishvara pranidhana dva. Or you can surrender to Ishvara. This is, he said, it's an option. It's not that it's not mandatory. Not everybody has to practice bhakti, but it's another way to the same goal, which is very striking. This sutra, and along with several of the next ones, so the very next one, I think, 1.24, defines Ishvara as the first teacher. That's what Swamiji has in mind when he says in the form of a first teacher. And exactly what it means, it's a good question, but it's complicated. And because I'm a scholar, I try to avoid making sweeping generalizations and say this has to be this and not that. These things are complicated. And in fact, even this question of what exactly is Ishvara in Patanjali's yoga philosophy is an enormously controversial question in the scholarly literature. We'll talk about it when we actually eventually, hopefully in this lifetime, get to 1.23 and 4 in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. But I'm just going to anticipate a little bit. So there are some scholars who say that this Ishvara, sorry, I should be off here. Okay. Okay. Ishvara is not at all the theistic god of bhaktas. It's completely different. It's like at best, it's a kind of ever-perfect Purusha or something. Like a Purusha who is never bound, whereas we are Purushas who are bound now, who are trying to get liberation. Ishvara seems to be this Purusha who was never afflicted with with suffering or with any bondages, something like that. That's one interpretation. Gerald James Larson was a very prominent scholar who passed away a few years ago. He was at UCSB. He's one of these people who endorses that kind of understanding of Ishvara. We can call it, philosophers use fancy words, so a deflationary interpretation of the term Ishvara. It means not making such a big deal out of it, saying that's not a big deal. But there are other scholars of yoga philosophy, including Edwin Bryant. I should have brought the book. Maybe I'll bring it next time. It's a fat book which was published about 10 years ago on the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. He's a contemporary scholar. And he has exactly the opposite reading. He says that Ishvara in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra is the theistic god, more or less. Not exactly the same. It's not the creator god exactly. But it is the god of bhakti. And you can practice bhakti toward that god. You can pray to that god. God can answer your prayers, and so on and so forth. So there's a whole spectrum of interpretations of what Patanjali means by Ishvara here and what it means to surrender to Ishvara. There, on one side of the spectrum, you have people who say that it basically is kind of bhakti. Patanjali is recommending a bhakti practice directed toward a theistic god. And at the other extreme, you find people saying that Ishvara in Patanjali has really no similarity with the theistic God, which is omnipotent, omniscient, and who responds to our prayers, who creates this world. And there are many interpretations in between that on that spectrum as well. Okay, so it's complicated is the point. But Swamiji is I don't think he's taking a very strong stand, but he's clearly on this side of the spectrum, closer to Edwin Bryant. Because he's saying that Patanjali admits a personal God. Now, he's not, but in the form of a first teacher. So it depends on what that means, as Narayana is asking, and we'll need to get to that before and it's complicated. We'll have to look at different commentators and different interpretations. But yeah, you can consider it, one way of interpreting it as the first guru, the guru of all gurus, in a sense. But that by itself doesn't just make Ishvara the equivalent to the theistic God that can respond to prayers and this and that. You see, so it's the question still stands. Exactly how robust is the concept of Ishvara in Patanjali's yoga philosophy, and how close is it to the God of bhakti traditions? You know, the God of Christianity, Allah, or Krishna, or Vishnu, right? Okay, I pretty much covered what I wanted to today. So any questions? Yeah. Bala first, and then Niranjana. And do we have online questions too? Maybe I should check. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Swami, in the Gita also there is references to Sankhya, and I believe hearing more like it's referred to there like somewhat like Jnana Yoga. Is it because there also there is discrimination? Like, can you talk about Sankhya's reference in Gita? And then the second question is, so there is no talk of what's the connection between all these souls?
Wow, that's you. Okay, yeah, sorry.
There's no connection between all these souls. Like, is it Purusha or Purushas? In Sankhya.
What's the second question? Sorry?
You said there's Purusha and Prakriti.
Yeah.
But you said there are many souls.
Yeah.
Say.
I don't mean to say that there's only one Purusha. I mean that, there are multiple Purushas.
So does Sankhya talk about what's the connection between the Purushas?
Well, that's one of the biggest philosophical problems in Sankhya and Yoga is...
Okay.
Once you've made this bifurcation, how do you connect them again? There is no connection. That's what the fundamental lesson is, and it's a mistake to think that there's a connection between them. But it's more complicated than that, actually.
So what about the first
question was
the Sankhya reference in Gita?
Oh yeah. So in the Gita, the term Sankhya is used very, very frequently as a kind of synonym for Jnana Yoga. It's a kind of Vedantic form of Sankhya. It's like... the main spiritual practice is discrimination between Atman and Anatman, non-self, but with the important difference that Sankhya in the Gita, and Sri Aurobindo will talk about this, we'll see this when we get to it in the book eventually, in Essays on the Gita, because he's in our Gita class. Sankhya in the Gita posits a single Purusha, not multiple Purushas, or Atman. Atman is a synonym for Purusha. Okay, but it's similar. So, of course, Sankhya precedes Gita as a philosophical school. So Gita had in mind, of course, it knew that it was aware, Gita is aware of the Sankhya school of philosophy, but it's giving it, that Sankhya school, a bit of a Vedantic twist by taking the Atman to be one rather than multiple. Okay? Let's see. So Niranjana had a question.
Okay.
Yeah. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Is Swamiji doing in this book what we're doing with the Gita? Because if it's Tantra mixed with Vedanta mixed with Patañjali, wouldn't that be a synthesis like Ramakrishna's Vijnana? And then wouldn't Swamiji be reinterpreting that scripture in light of Sri Ramakrishna?
Yeah, okay, so you're asking a question based on the fact that you're a student in this other class that I'm teaching.
I'm just saying, based on the
Gita.
fact that Swamiji said to reinterpret the scriptures in light of Sri Ramakrishna.
I'm giving context to online people who have no idea what you're talking about. But because many people don't know I'm teaching a Gita class, so I'm just explaining that. So I teach a Gita class, Bhagavad Gita in the light of Sri Ramakrishna, and Niranjana is asking whether Swamiji isn't doing something similar to what we, in this other class that I'm teaching on the Gita,
and what he said to do. Mm-hmm. Right? He said to read the scriptures.
Yeah, but it's a little bit more complicated than that, because the thing is, if you recall from the first class we had on the Gita, I quoted from Swami Vivekananda saying again and again, it's very important to try to understand what the original scriptures mean, and to go back to the original meaning, and not to blindly follow the traditional commentators because they're distorting the meaning. And there's a place where, for instance, he scolds one of his disciples, Shuddhanandaji, for reading Shankara's commentary on the Brahma Sutra. And he said, I want you to understand the literal meaning of the Sutrakara, the one who made the sutras, the Brahma Sutras themselves.
Oh, okay. So
the thing is, within the context of Patanjali, I think what he's doing is, he is trying to give, to a certain extent, a faithful translation and interpretation of Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, while at the same time bringing in elements that are foreign to Patanjali's system, like Kundalini Yoga, for instance.
In light of Ramakrishna. Like after
Yeah.
having his teachings, he's coming
Yeah.
back to Patanjali.
Yeah, but you see how, some people, critics, will call that text torturing, and saying that, there's no justification for bringing in Kundalini here because Patanjali doesn't accept Kundalini Yoga. Or why do you say, bring in the 4 yogas, because Patanjali doesn't talk about the 4 yogas. Stuff. Do you see what I'm saying? Okay. I'll try to address some online questions. Okay, one question. Maharaj, is Karmakanda important? I was always of the belief that it is the kindergarten phase. Please help me understand this. Karmakanda, in its purest form, like the literal sense of Vedic rituals having to be done in a particular way, they become all but defunct. I say all but defunct because some people in India insist that they exist in certain forms, which is true. In some places, especially in South India, you might find some places where they do these elaborate sacrifices according to the Vedic injunctions. But in general, yeah, it's given way to these kinds of Vedic ritualistic sacrifices have given way to more tantric practices like puja. Puja itself is basically rooted in tantra. Puja, the things that we do, like Durga Puja, we're going to have Kali Puja next week. These are more tantric than Vedic, actually. But the beauty of Hinduism and Vedic Hinduism is that it happily absorbs things from other traditions without feeling conflicts. And so that's one of the things that has been, puja is one of the prominent features of mainstream Hinduism and Vedanta now, even though its roots are in Tantra. So I would say that Karmakanda as such, in the literal sense, is not particularly important. But it's useful to understand it, have a rudimentary understanding of it, so that you can understand Vedanta, which is crucially important. Because Vedanta is kind of building on Karmakanda while going beyond it, pointing out the limitations of Karmakanda and going beyond it. Right? Another question. Okay, somebody's asking, if the body is a gross form of matter, how can we all be God? If the body is a gross form of matter, how can we all be God? Because we're not God as bodies. God is a more fundamental, immaterial entity within us. It's a spiritual entity, separate from the body. But at the same time, this is not Vijnana Vedanta is not Shankara's Advaita, and so I don't say that the body is unreal. The body itself is a manifestation of the divine at the physical level. And so one thing that I find striking is in the Taittiriya Upanishad, which talks about the 5 selves, most people say 5 koshas, K-O-S-H-A-S. That term is never used. The term kosha is nowhere to be found in the entire Taittiriya Upanishad. Two terms are used instead. Purusha and Atma. There are the 5 Atmas, which literally means 5 selves, 5 beings. Annamaya, Pranamaya, Manomaya, Vijnanamaya, Anandamaya. And the 5 Purushas. Again, which means conscious soul, right, self. You see. And so, yeah, from the standpoint of Vijnana Vedanta, the body is the instrument of the soul, an instrument of the divine, but that the divine can actually manifest at the level of the body, but also at the level of the mind, at the level of the prana. Okay? Another question. I have to sift through a lot of... Okay. When did Kundalini Yoga get... Okay, this is a pretty technical question. When did Kundalini Yoga get assimilated with Patanjali's Ashtanga Yoga to get the form called as Rājayoga now? It traces back to whom and when before Swamiji. Yeah, this is a good historical question. The thing is, as I said, I think that Swamiji himself was very original, and that I don't think we give him enough credit, and he doesn't give himself enough credit for having pioneered some of these moves. And I think that this unique combination of or understanding Raja Yoga as Patanjali's yoga philosophy combined with Kundalini Yoga, combined with aspects of Vedanta, is his own original synthesis. Scholars have written on this, and they have different views. And so Elizabeth de Michelis has written a book. In one of the chapters, she has a whole chapter devoted to analyzing Swami Vivekananda's Raja Yoga and its historical sources. And she claims that Theosophy actually preceded him in taking Raja Yoga to be based on Ashtanga Yoga, which is possible. But this, if you look at Raja Yoga as a whole, you're not going to find everything you find here in Theosophy. It's his own original synthesis. Okay. Himaja is asking, she's one of our Gita students, I understand Ishvara Pranidhana as surrendering to God. Can you please explain how it is different from bhakti? Okay, I hope you, did you catch what I said 10 minutes ago?
You did not, you said it was bhakti.
No, I hope I didn't say that either. I hope I said that there's a spectrum of interpretations of this sutra, Ishvara Pranidhana. It literally means surrender to Ishvara. That's what it means. Now, how to interpret surrender to Ishvara is complicated. And as I said, there are different interpreters, different interpretations of the same sutra. Some saying that it's essentially a bhakti practice directed toward a theistic God, and others saying it's not at all like a bhakti practice. Because the Ishvara in Patanjali's yoga philosophy is not the theistic personal God who creates this world, who responds to our prayers. And I don't want to give a facile answer to that question. I think Swami Vivekananda stands closer to the theistic side, the theistic kind of interpretation of Ishvara in Patanjali. And that interpretation is supported, I think, by modern scholars like Edwin Bryant. That's all I'll say. And Himaja, knowing that, because I've spoken to her about this, she also is of that school of thought. So I suggest, Himaja, that you look at Edwin Bryant's book, Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, because he'll help you kind of defend your view more rigorously. All right. And I think this is, yeah, okay. A lot of the other stuff is, I'm not going to answer it. Okay, good. Any final questions from anyone who is here now, present with us? No? All right, I think this is hopefully a good first class and a good start. And next time, please do try to bring some version, either soft or hard copy of Raja Yoga, so we can follow it along together. Thank you. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.